the fleet carrier, the most impressive fighting machine the world has ever seen. This one ship can unleash a greater variety of lethal weapons with a greater destructive power at longer range than any man of war in history. By the time she reaches the end of her working life, this ship will be 50 years old. The battleships she replaced seldom lasted, at the most, half that time. And they were, for centuries, the backbone of every navy. For the past 40 years, the aircraft carrier has dominated naval warfare. This veteran will never become out of date. Her weapons and her technology are constantly renewed. The carrier will be around for another 40 years. We are on board USS Forrestal, 80,000 tons of steel, home for nearly 5,000 men, a floating airfield for 70 or more combat aircraft. Forrestal is a maritime air base. She can move at 40 miles an hour, 1,000 miles a day. Forrestal is home for very powerful aircraft, several squadrons of them. She can fly the whole lot off in half an hour. Combat aircraft are a match for any others in the sky, detecting and destroying submarines, destroying other ships, or hitting targets many hundreds of miles inland. She can deliver every sort of missile and bomb, including nuclear bombs. Forrestal has the right aircraft for every one of those tasks. No wonder the carrier became the capital ship, the backbone of the Navy. Both American and British navies were quick to see the importance of the aeroplane at sea. Even before World War I, they were flying aircraft off ships. It wasn't quite like this, though. If at first you don't succeed, they even laid a few planks across the big guns of a battle cruiser. Hasty improvisation that worked. Another type of aircraft carrying ship, a converted cross-channel ferry. In those primitive days, sailors thought the aeroplane was simply for scouting. It would be what the frigates had been for Nelson, what the cruisers were at Jutland, the eyes of the fleet. As early as 1917, the Royal Navy was getting closer to the true aircraft carrier. There was a runway of sorts, and aircraft could fly off. but still aircraft couldn't land on deck. Then at last, they got it, HMS Argus. Converted from an Italian passenger liner, she was the world's first flat top. Her navigation bridge sank flush with the deck. It caused some difficulties in steering the ship, but it did provide a clear flight deck. Argus had a hangar for the aircraft and workshops to service them, a lift to bring them up to the flight deck. Argus was the original aircraft carrier. A little clumsy looking maybe, but truly the prototype of more than 200 that followed, and they're still being built. Between the wars, the Royal Navy invented or perfected almost all the techniques of shipborne flying. Britain was ahead of the world in everything, except the aircraft. In those days, the Royal Air Force had the monopoly of all military flying. Naval aviation was split between the two services. A naval flyer had to be an officer in both the Navy and the Air Force. One result of this dual control was that the Navy didn't get the aircraft its aviators deserved. But even if they had, the Admiralty didn't really understand the proper uses of maritime air power. They still thought aircraft were for scouting, and with luck, to delay the enemy until the battle fleet could catch up. Airmen were spotters for the big guns. To the admirals, the aircraft was a useful long-range telescope, not yet a long-range gun. Just before World War II, the Royal Navy regained full control of its air arm at sea. But British naval aviation was hobbled by history. They still didn't have the best aircraft. There was one outstanding British carrier aircraft, the Fairey Swordfish. Known affectionately as the string bag, the Swordfish was slow but sturdy. It could fly from a carrier in almost any weather. It could carry prodigious loads, and it was robust. In 1940, the Navy sent just a few to attack the Italian fleet at Taranto.
Now take a look at part of Mussolini's fleet at sea. Sensation. Actually, I need hardly point out this picture was taken before Italy entered the war. You'll notice the ships are moving. 3 out of 6 of his battleships almost blown out of harbor by our bombs.
The first ever airborne torpedo attack from carriers had sunk 3 battleships. The aircraft carrier had come into its own. There were others who had already come to the same conclusion. December the 7th, 1941. The Japanese launched a strike force of 350 aircraft from nearly 300 miles off Hawaii. The carrier had become the most important ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The other ships were used to protect them, even the hitherto all-powerful battleships. Attacking Pearl Harbor, there wasn't just one carrier, there were 6. The Japanese knocked out all but one of these 8 American battleships. By good luck, the American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. The destruction at Pearl was immense. Japan was about to seize an empire in the Pacific. The American Navy had to be put out of action. That's why they attacked Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese didn't finish the job. They reckoned without American sea power, based on their carriers. The carrier was the American capital ship too, and the fast carrier striking force was the fleet, the true descendant of the old battle fleet. In the vast Pacific Ocean, the Americans had less need of shore bases. Their ships stayed at sea for months on end, supplied by the fleet train. Both the Americans and Japanese had long prepared for this war. American admirals were also air-minded. They had lost nothing to a separate air force. They had full control of their naval aviation, on shore as well as at sea. Some of America's admirals had themselves been aviators. They had a feel for this kind of war, and they knew what kinds of machine their pilots wanted. They had the right aircraft embarked in the right ships. They were such good aircraft that the Royal Navy acquired a great number for themselves. These were the aircraft that in the end swept the Japanese from the skies and sank 5 battleships, 11 carriers, 150 other Japanese warships. Navy pilots were well trained. They had to be. Everything about flying from a carrier was dangerous, especially when returning from a mission. The war in the Pacific was mainly an American war. But by the end of it, there were 5 big fleet carriers of the Royal Navy with the American fleet. In one respect, they were far superior. They had armor-plated decks and sides, but American carriers had wooden planking on the flight deck and no armor. That cost them dear when the Japanese launched their kamikaze suicide attacks. The carriers were the principal ships of the Pacific fleets. They were huge and tempting targets. Everything depended on them, victory or defeat. In the final stage of the war, 2,500 fanatical Japanese pilots volunteered to fly a one-way mission to certain death to destroy them. Most of those kamikaze pilots never reached their target, but 1 in 10 did get through. Nearly 200 ships were hit. The carrier Franklin, after attack from the air, nearly 1,000 dead and wounded. Still afloat, but useless as a fighting ship. By the end of the war, America deployed 100 carriers, mostly in the Pacific. There are only 20 in the whole world today. Naval warfare had become carrier warfare. The Second World War taught the Royal Navy that sea power also means air power. Every naval commander must have his own planes. Without some sort of carrier, an admiral would have only his helicopters and shore-based Air Force planes if they can reach him in time. But the ocean is so vast, there is no substitute for high-performance aircraft based at sea as part of the fleet. But to build a new fleet carrier today would cost £1,000 million, and Britain can't afford them any longer. But we can still afford the high-performance aircraft that our admirals must have at sea. The Sea Harrier, a British invention. It doesn't need a long flight deck or a steam catapult. It doesn't need arrestor wires. Its carrier doesn't have to turn into wind for launching. Put the Sea Harrier on board a new kind of carrier, the Invincible class. Invincible has yet another British invention, the ski jump. This gives the Sea Harrier an extra heavy punch. The Russians have also built a sort of Harrier carrier. This is one of them, the Minsk. The Americans are very likely to follow suit. But vertical takeoff carriers are still no substitute for the big carrier with big aircraft which can carry more, faster and farther. And big carriers like this will last into the 21st century. These huge aircraft carriers have been the supreme embodiment of sea power for 40 years, the latter-day ships of the line. Launching platforms for nuclear weapons and guided missiles, a complete anti-submarine and air defense system, a mobile air force. They must, one day, vanish as the battleship did. But by then, they're likely to have had a much longer run for their money. This is right at the other end of the warship scale from the great battleships and carriers. But she's every bit as important. This is sea power in practice all the year round. We are on board Her Majesty's ship Anglesey, an offshore patrol vessel. Anglesey is one of the Royal Navy's latest ships. She's small and not very fast, but she has enormous range, 7,000 miles. She has a complement of 34, and she can carry a few Royal Marines as well.
Look out, bearing right.
Her armament would be considered trivial if it weren't exactly what is required, one 40mm gun. In today's terms, Anglesey is a gunboat in the classic tradition. Anglesey's main fighting job is helping to defend Britain's oil rig platforms and pipelines in the North Sea. But from day to day, she and her sister ships form part of the Fishery Protection Squadron. Her bridge is alive with the chatter of the radio. They're constantly sweeping through all the frequencies used by seafarers going about their lawful occasions. One receiver is permanently tuned to the international distress frequency.
She's the exact equivalent of a maritime policeman on the beat. She spends most of her time at sea, round the coasts of Britain, from close inshore up to 200 miles out.
Anglesey keeps watch on the fishermen, on all fishing vessels in British waters, making sure they keep to the rules. A century ago, this boatload of seamen would have been boarding a suspected slave ship on the West African coast. Today, our gunboats spend most of their time in home waters. They're off to board a fishing vessel in the North Sea. Their job is to enforce the law inside British territorial waters, and to do so without causing an international incident. Anglesey stands off, well clear of the fishing vessel. Her captain doesn't want to get too close. He likes to keep clear of her nets. Rather more importantly, he doesn't want the fishermen to feel threatened by a man of war. All the year round, and whatever the weather, there are at least 4 offshore patrol vessels patrolling the coasts of the United Kingdom. Just like the policemen on the beat, their physical presence is more important than the number of arrests they make. Fishery protection may look simple, but it's one of the trickiest jobs the Royal Navy has to do. They're hemmed in by treaties and restrictions. The fishermen can be a prickly bunch. They've seen their very livelihood seriously threatened, and sometimes vanish. These fishermen will be returning to an East Coast port, vastly different from what it was at the beginning of the century. 80 years ago, the British fishing fleet, like the Royal Navy, was the biggest in the world. It was a far simpler world. When Queen Victoria was still young, her Foreign Secretary, Palmerston, was quite ready to use British sea power to protect British interests, or even punish what seemed to be injustice to a British subject. Sending in a gunboat was just about the most effective way of making your presence felt, with the might of the Royal Navy behind her. The old-style gunboat dates from the Crimean War. A big gun, a steam engine, shallow draft, the gunboat could run close inshore, even in shallow water. This one was on the river Tigris, showing the flag, and showing who was boss. Since the days of sail, there had been gunboats in China, fighting the Opium Wars. One of my ancestors was there, my great-great-grandfather, Benjamin Chimo. The steam gunboat penetrated deep into the heart of foreign territories by using the great rivers. They showed the flag far beyond the limits of empire. Other nations were imperial powers too. America had a sizable gunboat navy. Gunboat diplomacy could be tricky. You could get involved in someone else's war, like the USS Panay, overtaken by the invading Japanese armies, bombed and sunk. The Panay was evacuating the staff of the American embassy in Nanking. These civilians, as well as the ship's company, had to abandon their sinking ship. A dozen years later, it was the British frigate Amethyst, caught up in the swift advance of the Chinese Communist armies as they crossed the Yangtze. For more than 100 days, the ship was marooned under a flag of truce until she made her famous dash for freedom.
Gunboat diplomacy may today have become a term of contempt, but one of the finest chapters in the history of the Royal Navy was how they put down the slave trade between Africa and the New World. It was one of the Navy's most unpleasant, unrewarding, and unhealthy jobs, but it was faithfully done for 50 years. The captain of a British gunboat had to be something of an expert on international law. He also had to be a diplomat. In the captain's cabin of any warship, you would have found a copy of this book.
Instructions for captains of Her Majesty's ships of war employed in suppressing the slave trade in dealings with kings and chiefs of uncivilized states. It was on the west coast of Africa in 1852 that Commander Strange of HMS Archer signed a treaty with the chiefs of Badagry in what is now Nigeria.
The details are here, in case any other naval officer had occasion to remind the chiefs of Badagry. Article 8. Complete protection shall be afforded to missionaries or ministers of the gospel following their vocation of spreading the knowledge of Christianity and extending the benefits of civilization within the territory of the chiefs of Badagry. The trouble was, there were never enough gunboats to stop slavery and piracy and generally protect civilization.
It's the same story today. Gunboat officers still have to be experts on international law and diplomats. Though nowadays it's not the suppression of the slave trade on the West Africa station, but a guide to sea fisheries legislation and enforcement in home waters. 150 years of history can fall away in an instant. Off the slave coast or off the Dogger Bank, the captain would have been having much the same sort of conversation with his boarding officer. In the old days, he'd have bawled through a megaphone. Now, he's got radio.
Anglesey boarding officer.
Morning, officer, over.
This is Anglesey. What did he have in his the catch he's just hauled?
The Fishery Protection Squadron is required to uphold the law, just like the policeman on the beat. But if a tactful word or a light touch can keep the peace, so much the better.
Roger, are the friendly bunch over there?
The very last thing this gunboat captain would want to do is to use his gun, any more than his brother officers did over the last 100 years or so. The mid-1970s in the waters off Iceland. The Icelanders had imposed a fishing ban in their waters. Their own gunboats trailed wire cutters to slash through the trawler's gear. The Royal Navy sent frigates to see them off. At £20 million a copy, and with a hull only as thick as a pencil at the waterline, a fast modern frigate was certainly not the ideal ship to take on the sturdy Icelandic gunboats. Night after night, the television news showed scenes like this.
Finally, Balder came in on a run further ahead than before and cut across Diomede's bows. The damage was not severe, neither to Balder nor Diomede.
The Royal Navy frigates, with their guided missiles and their guns, could, of course, have blown every Icelandic gunboat out of the water. And as they were thrown about the seas, having to exercise enormous restraint and being criticized by British fishermen for not acting much tougher, there were some individual sailors at that time who thought we should have done.
Sink the bloody things. As far as we're concerned, they're no good.
An understandable reaction, but one that had to be avoided. The British government had no wish to go to war with Iceland. The Royal Navy quite certainly didn't want to. So very expensive, fast frigates had to play bumper cars in the North Atlantic. Not just a cod war, but even a Cold War underlines the fact that it requires several sorts of warship to make up a whole navy. Each has a part to play at different levels. And in her way, the gunboat's job is as important as that of the battleship in the exercise of sea power.
At one extreme, an immensely sophisticated force. At the other, force for those occasions when you can be too heavily armed. Times when it's not what you do, but what you don't do that wins the day. A maritime policeman on the beat